So I think we can probably start. It's 3 past 3. It's probably time. And welcome everyone. Good afternoon. And I'm very happy to introduce you to Julia Behrman. She is an associate professor of sociology, and she's also faculty fellow of the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University, and she is a sociologist and a demographer. She started doing research on low and middle income countries, fertility in sub-Saharan Africa, also mainly, and her recent work addresses low fertility settings, both in Europe and the US. And today she's going to give a talk about mapping the strength and character of the norm to have children with some experimental evidence from the US. So, Julia, the floor is yours. I think you're going to talk for 40 minutes, and then we're going to leave some space for questions later. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me to do this and accommodating me doing it over Zoom. I'm really happy to be here and happy to be presenting a relatively new project. And really the kind of motivation of the project is a lot of the dialogue on low fertility at the moment. And obviously a lot of countries around the world are characterized by low fertility right now. And the causes of low fertility have been much discussed, right? So there's a lot of literature, a lot of attention to thinking about how economic uncertainty and instability affects low fertility, particularly in this moment, when a lot of especially high-income, low fertility societies are characterized by rising inequality. There has historically been quite a bit of work around changing norms about the importance of having children, and we can see this as kind of falling under the purview of the theory of the second demographic transition, among others, about how shifting social norms play a profound role in explaining fertility change. And of course, there have been theories of gender inequality and fertility, and particularly the ways in which sort of the unequal pace of change in the private sphere has not really corresponded with women's rising labor force participation and so on. And today I'm going to be speaking or engaging the most with this second explanation up here, with thinking about changing norms. And I'm throwing this all up here not to suggest that there's any one explanation for low fertility, because likely there are, a lot of things going on at once. But I'm really going to be thinking about our methods for assessing norms and how norms have changed as sort of a key part of this story of low fertility. So I want to start and briefly review some of the dominant approaches we have for measuring childbearing norms. And then I want to talk about both their strengths and their limitations. And I'll spend the bulk of the talk presenting results from a pilot survey experiment that I recently conducted that's mapping the strength and the character of the norm to have the children. And this pilot was carried out in the U.S. So I will be talking quite a bit about the U.S., although I'll try to bring in other contexts as well, as thinking through ways we can sort of innovate beyond our conventional approaches for measuring childbearing norms. But to start, how do we measure childbearing norms? So what I have up here are, a range of standard questions about fertility preferences, with some major surveys carried out in the US and Europe. And we see sort of a suite of questions. And it's typically this general ideal question that's taken as a proxy for broader childbearing norms. So this is typically a question that goes something like, what do you think is the ideal number of children for a family to have? It's part of, a battery of widely used household surveys. And it's generally taken as capturing underlying social norms about the ideal number of children to have in a given society, right? It's taken as a better measure of norms than something like personal intentions or expectations, which might capture people's more specific constraints. But ideal family size is really seen as kind of this proxy for broader normative statements about what family size is normatively ideal. And if we think about what we know about ideal family size from survey data, and here I'm going to focus largely on the US, we can think about how what we know has changed over time. So if we go back to demographers working in the 1960s, looking at the mean ideal family size for men and women, we see fairly high ideal family sizes, around three, right? Over three, between three and four, which is sort of generally consistent with trends for fertility in the time. And then if we look at the percentage of respondents saying that two children are ideal among both men and women in the US, what we see is that between 1940 and 1970, this percentage of respondents who start saying two children are ideal really starts to take off at the end of the 60s and into the 70s. So this is really sort of evidence of this entrenchment of this idea of a two-child norm, where two children is really viewed as normatively acceptable, as represented by these, average ideal family sizes around two. And we see this pretty consistently if we look at household surveys between 1970 and the early 2000s. This is still in the US, but we see average ideal family sizes are consistently about 2.5. If you break it down by category, by far the largest cumulative percentage for ideal family size is this two child. So averages are about two, and two is certainly a widely shared category. And if we carry this to the present or closer to the present, I guess this is my own work. It's already, it ends in 2008, so it's already a little dated by now, but we see, a lot of consistency, even when we're carrying this data forward through sort of the Great Recession in 2008, and then kind of right before the start of COVID. And once again, we see consistency whether we look at these average ideals or whether we break this down by category, right? We see two children is by far the most prevalent category. Now, if we turn to Europe, and this is pooled data for women of reproductive age going from the late 70s until around 2012, we also see relative stability in ideal family sizes, once again around 2.5, although we are seeing some difference in the minimum and maximum over time. So if we look at the data and we think about what we know about ideal family size, we would say there really is this enduring evidence of ideal family sizes around two, or maybe even a little higher than two in low fertility countries in Europe and the US. And this is taken as a strong supporting norm for a family size of two children, and really evidence of the endurance of this two-child norm to the present, right? Where it's sort of normatively most acceptable or desirable to have two children. And this seems to be a relatively stable thing, which is somewhat surprising because in many of the countries I've been showing data from in both the US and Europe, we have seen declines in fertility. So it's quite interesting that this normative measure seems so stable. Now, capturing ideal family size in household surveys, it has a lot of advantages. And I think we see those advantages in a lot of the figures I just showed. It allows us to have a long time series, which is super useful for thinking about change. We see these measures are commonly embedded within representative surveys. We can do comparison, right? We can do cross-national comparison. And ideal family size in household surveys, we can look at how it correlates with other variables. So we can look at how work hours or marital status predict someone's ideal family size. That being said, I think it's worth thinking through whether ideal family size is a good measure of childbearing norms, or perhaps, put another way, whether it should be our only measure. And I think it's worth thinking through some of the limits of the measure. So, ideal family size tells us a lot about, the quantum of an ideal, but not necessarily the strength of that ideal. So it doesn't really tell us how important it is to achieve this ideal, particularly when people are faced with competing work and family constraints, right? So we could look, as I mentioned, at how work predicts ideal family size, but we still really don't know that much about strength. And this gets us to a second question, right? What do we make of this gap between ideal family size and the total fertility rate? This is a study that uses data from the early 2000s, so it's already quite a bit dated, but we can see, looking at the UK, there's a pretty sizable gap between what people are stating as their ideal family size and the total fertility rate at the time. If we look at the US, there's also a gap. It's not as large, but if we were to project this, project into the future today, this gap would be a lot larger in the US because fertility has fallen a lot since this study was conducted. So, does this gap mean that people are unable to realize their ideals? Or does it mean that realizing ideals is not a priority? Put another way, is the two-child norm strong, but is it unattainable? And it could be unattainable for a lot of reasons, right? It could be unattainable for economic reasons, for problems balancing work and family, and so on. Alternatively, the norm to have two children could just be weak. Now, another, potential constraint could be whether we should even be comparing ideal family size, which is a measure of completed fertility, to TFR, which is ultimately a period measure. But even when studies have looked at ideal family size compared to actual family size among those ages 42 plus, so presumably completed fertility, we do see a gap, right? So this question about how to make sense of unrealized fertility, it is quite meaningful nonetheless. Now, I think another limit of ideal family size is how we make sense of non-numeric responses. And in particular, whether our understandings of ideal family size and of family norms change if we include non-numeric responses. And this is some work from Heather Racken that shows that if we look at ideal family size in the US and we just exclude non-numeric responses, we see, a pretty stable two-child ideal. And this is, using more recent data going to 2025. But if we alternatively include non-numeric responses, we actually see in recent years that there's been a trend upwards in non-numeric responses and downward in this two-child ideal. And it's hard to know how to make sense of these non-numeric responses. We don't know if someone who answers don't know to ideal family size has a strong preference or a weak one. If they were forced to choose a numeric response, what would they choose? This is all a little unclear. And because of this, scholars have developed a number of alternatives to assessing childbearing norms. So pretty prominently in the 1970s was the Kuhn scale, which is derived from psychological measurement theory on scaling of attitudes and preferences. So you're basically asked about your ideal family size. Say you give a response of 3, you're then asked, okay, suppose you can't have 3. Would you prefer 2 or would you prefer 4? And the idea is that in doing this exercise, you can sort of reveal the structure of preferences, which might be quite different from people's stated ideal family size. Other scholars like Jenny Trinitapoli and Sarah Yateman have tried to use methods that allow us to take into account the flexibility of fertility preferences. This has also been an attempt to get at these sort of limits of ideal family size. And then more recently, people have started to use survey experiments to get at childbearing norms, right? And they really, I think, build on and enhance what we can learn about in standard survey research. So These two studies, one of which I was involved in, are both using similar conjoint methods, right, to show that preference for two children compared to other numbers of children is actually weaker than we would expect based on standard survey measures of ideal family size. And this sort of calls into question the strength of this two-child norm. And we've also seen other work. So Leticia Martelletto and some colleagues have a study that uses a conjoint design that provides explanation to get at norms about who should be allowed to have a child, right? So I'm just sort of flagging these experiments quickly because I think they do provide a really interesting complement to what we can learn about ideal family size from household surveys. And I'll use that as a segue to talk about this new project that I want to spend the bulk of the rest of the time on. So this is a collaborative work with Nick Mark, who is a sociologist at University of Wisconsin, where we are mapping the strength and the character of the norm to have children in the US. I'm going to be presenting results today from a pilot that was just conducted in December 2025. It was conducted in Wisconsin, and our plan is to field this on a nationally representative panel as well. And we really see this project building on existing experimental studies, although we're taking somewhat of a different experimental approach than what has been used in the past studies I just mentioned. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but I do want to touch a little bit on the theoretical framing of the project. So here we're drawing on Andrew Cherlin's concept of the deinstitutionalization of marriage. So Cherlin argues, and he's writing specifically on the US, but in many ways, his argument is very consistent with the second demographic transition, which obviously has been applied much more broadly. But Cherlin argues that marriage in the US used to be this very highly institutionalized arrangement governed by a widely shared set of expectations and norms. And he argues that marriage has become a deinstitutionalized arrangement that's characterized by greater individual choice, greater flexibility, and much more normative ambiguity. And there has been a study that actually uses experimental evidence to test for the deinstitutionalization of marriage, ultimately finding support for the Cherlin argument. Now, we are drawing on this concept of deinstitutionalization of marriage to ask whether something is going on that's quite similar with childbearing. So, childbearing and especially motherhood has been characterized as a social institution in the US since the 1970s. And through the early 20th century, motherhood in particular, but also parenthood more broadly, was viewed as normative and socially expected. And we are using this deinstitutionalization framework to ask whether childbearing, which was once sort of this expected and defining marker of adulthood, has become more optional, more individualized, and more circumstantially contingent. So, in other words, has it become deinstitutionalized? And ultimately, this is a question about norms and whether the norm to have children is weak, and also to some extent, whether this has changed over time. And this is where we think experiments can play a very interesting role in assessing these questions. So we are using a factorial experiment that was originally developed to map the strength and character of political norms, but as I mentioned, has also been applied to test for the deinstitutionalization of marriage hypothesis. And in the factorial design, respondents are asked to assess multiple vignettes that describe hypothetical situations composed of randomly varied factors or attributes. And then they're asked about the extent to which they endorse a particular behavior in a hypothetical scenario. So in our case, we're asking them about the extent to which they endorse childbearing. And this design allows researchers to evaluate how each attribute influences respondents' judgments, their preferences, or their intended behaviors. So in our experiment, people are given a vignette with a hypothetical adult woman named Jessica who has no children, right? So we're holding both gender and parity constant, but we're randomly varying the attributes of Jessica, her age, her relationship status, the relationship quality, and also her socioeconomic background. And then we're asking respondents to advise whether Jessica should have a child. And respondents are evaluating 4 vignettes in total. And so we're assuming that people are making assessments about whether or not someone should have a child in a given scenario based on underlying norms about the context in which it's appropriate to have a child. So the idea here is by asking them to make multiple assessments, we can uncover patterns about the norms undergirding whether or not someone should have a child. So very quickly, I'll walk you through the attributes that we're randomly varying. So we're varying her age. So 28 is the average age of first birth for women in the US. We're also looking at an age that's younger and older than that on the younger and older ends. We're looking at varying partnership status, so whether someone's single, cohabiting, or married. We're varying relationship quality, the extent to someone is happy with their relationship situation. We're also varying financial status. So whether someone is struggling to pay the bills each month, has just enough, or has plenty extra. So this gives you a sense of what the vignettes look like. We say we're going to ask some questions about your feelings about whether people should have a child in various scenarios based on your personal values about childbearing. I've flagged in red the aspects of the scenario that are being randomly varied. And after giving the vignette, where respondents are asked based on the circumstances and your personal values, should Jessica have a child in this scenario? And people are asked to give their response on a 7-point scale that ranges from very strong no to very strong yes. And you can see here's an example of another vignette. So we really have 3 goals. So the first is to map the strength and character of this norm to have children. And this is what allows us to get at this question of deinstitutionalization, right? Of whether the norm to have children is weak. Then we explore the circumstances under which the norm applies to get a sense of the contours of the norm. And we also look at cohort and education-based variation in the norm to have children. We look at cohort because given that this is a cross-sectional project, this is the best strategy we have for inferring change. Obviously, it is not a perfect strategy, but it's what we have. And we look at educational variation because there's conflicting evidence on whether the deinstitutionalization of marriage has unfolded evenly across those with and without a university degree. So here our access of educational stratification is university degree, and just a BA is a university diploma in the US. So as I mentioned, we did this pilot in December with a sample of about 2,500 respondents. This is high quality data, and it's a very high quality panel. That's a big part of the reason we chose it for the pilot. The main limit is that it is Wisconsin specific. So this is the state of Wisconsin for those who might not be familiar. And there are a few ways in which it's different from the national average. The population's older than average. It is less racially diverse than average. So it has a higher percentage of white respondents than in the US as a whole. And it also has a higher concentration of rural respondents compared to the national average. And you can see some of this in our sample, particularly if you look at, age heterogeneity or so on. And very dramatically, if you look at sample, our sample is 92% white, which is much higher than the national average. I want to get into the meat of our results right now. So the first thing we do is map the strength and character of this norm for childbearing. And this is following this approach laid out by Yasso and Opp and Robbins. And we map this strength and character across 4 dimensions. And I'm going to go into more detail, but in short, We're looking at whether people endorse or reject having a child. So this is polarity. We're looking at the extent to which endorsing and rejecting childbearing is context dependent, which is conditionality. We're looking at the strength of people's judgments, so intensity, and also consensus, so their level of shared agreement. So the first thing we're looking at is polarity. So in each vignette, as you recall, respondents are indicating whether the hypothetical respondent should have a child on this 7-point scale, with this midpoint, which is 4, representing neutrality. So here we're really assessing the directionality of the norm. Are people endorsing? Are they rejecting across the board? Are they sometimes endorsing and sometimes rejecting? So we look within each individuals across these 4 different vignettes that they evaluated. Does the respondent always endorse childbearing? Okay, so in this case, respondents are coded as prescriptive if all 4 responses are at or above this midpoint of 4, right? In contrast, respondents could have a proscriptive norm if they always reject childbearing. So across all 4 scenarios, respondents are at or below the midpoint in these ratings, right? So they're always rejecting. When respondents are sometimes endorsing and sometimes rejecting, this is coded as a bipolar norm, right? So, respondents are coded this if they are assigning values above the midpoint in some vignettes and below in others. And respondents are coded as neutral if they select the midpoint value in all 4 vignettes. So in a context where childbearing is strongly institutionalized, we would really expect a prescriptive norm to dominate. So people should be endorsing childbearing the vast majority of the time. Now, when we look at the proportion of respondents in each of these 4 categories, we find that by and large, the largest percent of respondents are in this proscriptive category. So they are actually largely rejecting childbearing across all 4 scenarios, with a sizable, about a third of respondents in this bipolar category. But actually, prescriptive category is relatively low, as is this neutral category. So the second thing we look at is conditionality. And this is a measure of whether the norm is stable or its context is dependent. And once again, this is assessed at the individual level. We're looking at within the same individual across the 4 scenarios they're evaluating, is the respondent assessing the same non-neutral rating to all vignettes? So this is sort of an unconditional norm. They're always giving the same rating. Are they assigning different ratings to vignettes? This would be evidence of a conditional norm. Or are they assigning the same neutral ratings to all vignettes? This would be a neutral or a non-existent norm. And if childbearing is strongly institutionalized, we would expect this to be an unconditional norm. We would expect that would predominate. And after categorizing each respondents as conditional, unconditional, or non-existent, we're looking at the proportion of respondents who vary in conditionality, and we see that the vast majority of respondents are conditional, right? Actually, only about 10% are unconditional and 11% are non-existent. The third thing we look at is the strength of adherence of each respondent's norm for childbearing. And this is assessed at the individual level once again, where we're looking at the distance of each of the 4 vignette ratings from neutrality, right? So neutrality is a score of 4. And then we're calculating individual specific means, where lower values closer to 0 signal less intensity, and higher values closer to 3 signal greater intensity. And once again, the institutionalization perspective would expect a strong level of intensity. What we find is that on this sort of intensity scale, which ranges from 0 to 3, the mean and median intensity is sort of average, about 1.5. And if we look at a kernel density plot that looks at where the values in the data are concentrated and how they're spread out, if we see a lot of mass near zero, that means respondents hover near neutrality. If we see a lot of mass over here, that means respondents take strong positions. But really what we see is that most people are in the middle with some extremes. And if we break this down by polarity and conditionality, we see that the higher intensity is concentrated among those who have sort of an unconditional norm, right? Both prescriptive, so always endorsing, but also proscriptive, always rejecting. And if we look at a kernel density plot by polarity and conditionality, we can see this more sharply. So we can see that particularly those who have sort of an unconditional proscriptive norm have a very high degree of intensity. So the final thing we look at is consensus. So institutionalization assumes a high level of consensus, right? And to assess this more formally, we run a series of two-level nested hierarchical linear models. The outcome is this childbearing assessment, whether or not, this 7-point scale about endorsing or rejecting childbearing. The predictors are the vignette number, is this the first or the second one you assess, and also these 4 attributes. And we're nesting vignettes within respondents, right? These are 2 levels. And in the first model, the intercepts and slopes are fixed to 0. In subsequent models, we sequentially add random intercepts and random slopes. And the idea is that a lack of improvement in model fit indicates homogeneity in the intercepts and slopes and consensus among respondents, whereas improvement in model fit indicates heterogeneity and, by extension, lower consensus. So in our first model, we find that model fit improves significantly when a random intercept specification is compared to a null model. So this indicates that there is substantial between respondent variation in endorsement of childbearing in these different scenarios. We also find that model fit improves when random slopes are added, which indicates significant between respondents heterogeneity in the effects of the different vignette attributes on these childbearing judgments. So, for example, the effects of age on endorsing childbearing and so on. So our synthesis of this first part is really that institutionalization would predict this high level of consensus for a norm that's prescriptive, it's unconditional, and it's high intensity. And we really find a lack of consensus for a norm that's either proscriptive or bipolar, conditional, and moderate intensity. So we take this as evidence of deinstitutionalization in our sample of this weakened norm to have children. Now, we also look at the circumstances under which the norm to have children applies. And we do this by looking at this 2-level hierarchical linear model with random slopes and intercepts. But here I'm focusing on interpreting the predictors. So we kind of ignored them when we were assessing for consensus. And in this model, I'm focusing specifically on the coefficients and which coefficients predict endorsing childbearing. So here in this plot, values greater than 0 are endorsing childbearing, less than 0 rejecting, 0 is neutral. We see that age is important. So relative to age 28, being older makes people more likely to endorse, and younger makes people less likely. Marital status is quite important. Marriage relative to cohabitation makes people much more likely to endorse, although we actually see no difference between cohabitation and being single. Financial status operates kind of exactly as you would expect. People are more likely to endorse when you have plenty extra money compared to just enough, and much less likely to endorse childbearing if someone is struggling financially compared to having just enough money. And relationship satisfaction is also quite important. So people are more likely to endorse childbearing in, a happy relationship, and much less likely in a unhappy relationship. Now, I'm going to look very quickly at cohort and educational variation. So I'm using these same hierarchical linear models with random slopes and intercepts, but I'm just adding controls for respondent cohort. And as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of the best imperfect way we can try and get at cohort change. What we really see is that our two older cohorts, which are being compared to this youngest cohort, so people born from the 19 onwards, we see that the older cohorts are both significantly more likely to endorse childbearing compared to this younger cohort. So there is some evidence of cohort variation. If we stratify our results by cohort, however, we see that things by and large look pretty similar. There's probably one big difference. So we see the magnitude of this coefficient on the effect of marriage compared to cohabitation and on endorsing childbearing. We see this is much larger for this older cohort compared to the younger ones. So perhaps some evidence of change there. As I mentioned, we also look at whether education predicts prescribed childbearing. We're stratifying by whether or not someone has a BA, which is a university diploma, compared to no BA. And we do see some interesting variation here where people with bachelor's degree are more likely to endorse childbearing. However, when we stratify by educational status, we see very little difference in the effects of these different attributes on endorsement of childbearing. So I want to recap very quickly so we have time for questions, but ultimately we see a lack of consensus for a norm that's proscriptive or bipolar, conditional, moderate intensity. We take this as evidence of deinstitutionalization. And the fact that older compared to younger birth cohorts are more likely to prescribe childbearing, that makes us think that perhaps there is some preliminary evidence of change over time. We see a number of interesting things predict childbearing endorsement. I think the relationship quality one is actually quite interesting because the magnitude of coefficients are large. And we might think, given that, what we know from the literature about how relationships have qualitatively changed over time, this may be, another area in which results today look different from in the past. I think there are a number of advantages to the approach, and I'm happy to go through those in more detail. And this provides, obviously an important complement to existing survey research on ideal family size. I don't see this as, taking the place of our survey-based measures, but I think experiments have a lot of potential to get at norms that can enhance what we know. There are, of course, limits. I think a major one for trying to do a project where sort of change is inherent to our question, the cross-sectional limit has concerns. As I mentioned, we have concerns about external validity since we're just focused on Wisconsin. And I think anyone doing online experiments right now is concerned about, bots and AI usage proliferation, which is part of the reason we wanted to use sort of a high quality established panel as opposed to one of the sort of online survey aggregators. I will note, as far as our next step, we are hoping to run the experiment on a nationally representative sample. We're hoping to include additional attributes. I'm particularly interested in whether there's gender variation in childbearing prescription. We would love to be able to do a follow-up study that might allow us to get at, within cohort change in a way that we're pretty limited by the cross-sectional data. And just some concluding thoughts. I think this project suggests that childbearing preferences and the norms that underlie them are, contingent, perhaps increasingly so, although, as I said, it's hard to tease that out using cross-sectional data. But I do think survey experiments can capture childbearing norms in ways that are very valuable, and we need more research and methodologies focused on these measures of strength and contingency above and beyond things like standard ideal family size. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.